Hello. Okay, this is my third lecture for the course on social change and globalization. I want to introduce the socioeconomic transformations or the method. I want to introduce the mechanisms that have triggered the main socioeconomic transformations that have contributed to human development, particularly as far as the growth of the GDP per capita is concerned. So in this lecture, I am going to outline the main theories of classical development studies. These studies have focused on low-income countries became wealthier over time. Actually, there are some historical examples of countries that were low income some decades ago, such as South Korea, and have become high income countries in the last decades. If we look at those processes over time since the 18th or the 19th centuries, some theories claim that we can actually track very similar processes throughout the world, starting from the very United Kingdom, where the Industrial Revolution took place in the 18th century. So in this lecture, I want to comment very briefly on the history of economic growth. We will have some time to look at Angus Madison's data more closely, and I will show you the links. You will have the information. You can compare countries, or you can do many things with this data. But the main point is that according to this, Angus Madison was an economist who had a long experience in both in the economy and international organizations. He produced one of the best known and most accepted and most widely accepted databases of economic growth over long periods of time for the whole world. The main finding of this data set is that long-term growth has been really important. Actually, the patterns that nowadays distribute the GDP per capita across the globe can be traced back to for centuries, even for about 1,000 years. If the land is so important, we can assume that agricultural innovation and long-distance trade were very important in the 12th century. That the invention of finance or the sophistication of finance in the 16th century made a difference, and that rural dispersed industrialization was also influential in the 16th to 19th centuries. So the Industrial Revolution that started in 1780 was crucial, but it was not. But it was not the whole story. However, this data set also highlights the great divergence between Europe and India and China in the 19th century. That divergence was not so acute in the early 19th century as it has been afterwards. So it's plausible to suggest that mass imports destroyed rural industry in these countries, and that political and military impositions of uneven trade terms actually made a big difference in the mid-19th century, thus eventually provoking famines and destruction and poverty both in India and China. We will also look at the details more closely, and I propose that you are aware of these long-term trends and the geographical divergences when thinking of the four theories that classical development studies have suggested, and I will briefly outline now. The first theory is modernization. Modernization basically means that all countries follow a very similar pattern, similar path towards the current, in order to become to develop very similar societies and economies to the Western countries in the second half of the 20th century. They modernized to the extent that they become modern, and by modern, these theories mean the features of current Western societies and economies. In the 1960s, Walt Rostov suggested that all countries followed the same sequence of stages of development, starting in traditional societies and finalizing in mass consumption economies. He particularly highlighted the leap, the takeoff that industrial revolution had meant in the UK in the last decades of the 18th century, and that he tried to identify in other countries along the 19th and the 20th centuries. As we see, Madison challenges these assumptions somehow. So here you have an interesting point for discussion. Theories of modernization have also discussed politics and culture. Rudolf Engelhardt, Samuel Eisenstadt have suggested that some similar paths of political, economic, and cultural changes can be identified over time. In their view, aligned economic, political, and cultural changes have really contributed to development. However, disparate bases of economic, political, and cultural changes have disrupted development, for instance, by disrupting democratization. Samuel Eisenstadt, for instance, suggested that Arab countries started their independence as, or many Arab countries started their independence as parliamentary republics or monarchies, but they did not become full democracies because this political development was not clearly aligned with parallel economic developments. Other authors have suggested that culture makes very big difference, has made very big contribution to modernization. So I have explored complex alignments of modern institutions with culture across the global world. For instance, in the same way as Puritan ethics contributed to work ethics and capitalism in 17th and 18th century, Europe, as Max Weber studies, these authors look for an Asian work ethics that have contributed to the progress of Asian nations in the second half of the 20th century. Other authors, such as Samuel Huntington, draw on this same finding to claim that late decades are witnessing a clash of civilizations where the alignment of modern institutions and modern culture are significantly different and can greatly contribute to conflict. An alternative view on socioeconomic transformation highlights the importance of capitalist dependency on this. According to this theory, independent nations have not been fully dependent after colonizations, but because they have been entangled, they've been submitted to the mechanisms of the capitalism institutions and processes that were particularly powerful in the core economies of the world system. So Samir Amin and Celso Furtado have argued that economic dependency, despite political independence, has been an important factor because of a number of very different mechanisms, such as unequal change or the subtle influence of multinational corporations. We will get into the details when we discuss some of these topics in the online forum. Other authors, such as André Gunder-Frank or Immanuel Wallerstein, which you know from the compulsory reading list in the previous topics, have distinguished between metropolitan and semi-peripheral and peripheral countries. They have argued that eventually metropolitan and semi-peripheral countries have exploited peripheral countries in a similar way as the capitalist class has exploited the working class in capitalist societies. So we cannot talk about full independence, but a kind of divides and international inequalities that actually impinge on the potential for development across the globe. Finally, a strand of dependency theories have argued that, such as Franz Fanon and Edward Said, have argued that cultural dependency is also at stake. These authors have argued that colonization was not only political and economic, it was also cultural. It produced a sort of colonization of minds that made very difficult, that posited newly independent countries of the second half of the 20th century with very difficult predicament, because these countries had to imagine themselves as something that was not so different to the cultural patterns that the old metropolis were positing. So they found they had to face very strong forms of violence that were not only related to the political imposition of empires, but also to the personal and the identity and the making in the newly independent countries. This strand of reflection has inspired the so-called post-colonialist studies that are really influential and important in the current conception of the social sciences. A third strand of theoretical thinking about development highlights the importance of institutional equilibrium. It highlights the importance of institutions that posit the right incentives for individuals to become fully rational economic actors. Douglas North, an economist and historian, Douglas North is one of the most well-known proponents of this theory. In his view, institutions foster prosperity by guaranteeing property, underpinning transparency, inducing respect for contracts, and strengthening trust. So here you have the institutional equilibrium. These are the institutions that posit the right incentives. North extends his argument to politics too, because he highlights important synergies between competition in both economic and political spheres. In his way, market competition is fully effective if eventually underpinned by elite competition for government. So we have political competitive democracies and open competitive markets, and this is the formula for prosperity and development in North's view. Finally, the human capital theory has also made an important contribution to the historical equilibrium approach. Human capital, some economists such as Gary Becker argue that human capital accumulates as an outcome of family decisions who decide to invest in the education and of their offspring. So parents actually make a difference by making more or less effective decisions on the human capital of their children. The theory also makes some hypotheses that human capital has consequences for all aspects of the economy and society. For instance, higher human capital helps individuals, to contribute to productivity. The individuals who are endowed with a higher human capital are more productive than other individuals who are not. They can actually make a stronger, a more significant contribution to production, and correspondingly may get a higher wage or a higher income. Becker and human capital analysts also suggest that human capital has positive effect or produce some non-monetary benefits, such as better public health. More educated people normally enjoy better health in many countries, so they claim that this kind of rational action is also at stake in this domain. Finally, the political economy approach to international development, or to development as a socioeconomic transformation, highlights the importance of power relations. Actually, this theory is the reaction to modernization and institutional equilibrium, and these authors claim that power relations may both favor and disrupt modernization and institutional equilibrium. So it's not an issue of aligning political and economic and cultural changes. It's an issue of power. Some power relations favor this alignment, while other ones do not. And it's not an issue of equilibrium between individual incentive or between institutions and incentives for individuals. That is an outcome of power relations that may favor or not this kind of equilibria. Peter Hall, some political scientists and sociologists, these are some researchers that work in between these two disciplines. I have observed variable historical paths. I'm not going to get into the details. These authors have distinguished market-led and coordination or strategic market-led economies and coordination-led economies, but I will not get into the details. Some of these authors is often drawn on the importance of the developmental state of a state in the low and middle income countries, as it happened in Eastern Asia. I think that the point is that the coordination led by states seems to have been key, according to this theory. Somehow in a similar vein, other authors have argued social movements and identity politics have also contributed to development to the extent that have contributed to express projects for development. Sometimes our democratic countries have facilitated this expression, but this is not the only issue. So these authors, Alain Touraine, for instance, argue that there may be some synergy between democracy and social movements, but this is not the pattern everywhere, and both processes can be parallel or even can even be contradictory depending on the countries and the historical movements. Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Arturo Escobar have made arguments in a similar vein, as we will explore in our readings and our debates. Finally, last but not least, it's important to be aware that priorities for development are not defined regardless of inequalities, but in the midst of intersectional inequalities. Some feminist scholars, such as Lourdes Benaria or Kimberly Crenshaw, have argued that most of the theories that I have outlined so far are blind to gender, are not aware or do not pay enough attention to the role of women in development, or simply assume that women are an instrument for development but not a subject as themselves. So these theories have claimed we have to look at power as these authors claim, and we have to look at the role of the state, we have to look at class struggles, but we have to introduce gender in the story or in this account. Otherwise, we cannot make sense of the whole picture, or where we don't see the big picture. These authors have also noticed that gender and class are not the only relevant sectional types of inequalities, of categories of inequality. Roughly, they have also claimed that a number of language, kinship, religious, national classifications are at stake. They have drawn on the tradition of research on ethnicity, which mostly looks at all these phenomena as ways of classifying human individuals and creating more or less clearer or not clear human groups or social groups. By the way, I don't mean that language, religion, nation are only classifications. These social phenomena are many other things. But the interest of ethnicity is that that it's important to focus on how this phenomena inspire criteria for classifying people and creating social groups. So in the end, an interesting strand of political economy argues that development must be understood in interaction or or that suggests that inequalities intermingle with development, and inequalities have to do with a variety of social categories. Social class is one of them, but gender is important too, and they intermingle, social classes intermingle with genders, as it's obvious. Men and women are located in different social classes, but these two kinds of social categories are also related to ethnicity in various complex ways that are not the same everywhere in the world. But we have to be aware of the local connections. This approach is normally labeled as the intersectional approach to society, to many phenomena such as development, among other important themes of the social sciences. I've concluded with a comparative summary that I will not elaborate, but just I will just leave it here so that we can draw on this slide when we discuss our compulsory reading list, and we try to compare the theories and how the authors use these theories and apply them to make sense of international development and human development. And we will also discuss the connections between international development and human development. These are two fruitful academic levels that you will learn to define and to use in very different ways. Thank you very much for your attention. I will just finish the recording.